Margaret Dawson didn't cry when the judge read the ruling. She stood in that cold Illinois courthouse in her best dress, the navy one with the seam she'd resewn 3 times, and she held her chin level while the words fell on her like stones. Debt. Default. 30 days to vacate. Her ex-husband's new wife sat 2 rows back with her gloves and her clean hat, smiling the kind of smile that women smile when they've already won, and they want you to know it. Margaret felt her daughter Emily grip her hand from behind. She squeezed back once. Hard. She would not break here, not in front of these people, not today. If you've ever been the woman that everybody looked past, if you've ever been told you were too much and not enough at the same time, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Margaret Dawson had $31 to her name, 3 children who hadn't eaten a full supper in 4 days, and a landlord who had already slid the eviction notice under her door twice because he enjoyed watching her read it. She lived in the kind of building in the east side of Chicago, where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and every baby crying and every bottle being set down on a wooden floor, and she had learned to exist inside those thin walls without asking for anything from anyone, because asking had never once in her life produced a result worth the humiliation of the asking. She was 41 years old. She had been pretty once or so, she'd been told, though she couldn't remember a time when her size hadn't been the first thing anyone mentioned when they talked about her. Too big. Too heavy. Too much to look at. Too much to feed, too much to accommodate. She had heard every variation of that sentence for so long that it had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like a fact, the way winter feels like a fact, the way debt feels like a fact. Something true and fixed and entirely beyond the possibility of argument. Her husband, Charles Dawson, had married her when she was 22, and he was 26, and she had believed the way young women believe things, that being chosen meant being valued. Charles had a sharp tongue and a fast temper, and a talent for making Margaret feel grateful that he had picked her at all, and for 15 years she had organized her entire existence around the project of not disappointing him. She cooked. She cleaned. She bore him children, and buried one of them, a boy 3 weeks old, gone before she'd had time to name him anything that felt true, and she swallowed that grief the same way she swallowed everything else, quietly, privately, in the early hours of the morning when the rest of the house was asleep. Charles left on a Thursday in April. He had been seeing a woman named Mrs. Caroline Fitch, recently widowed, recently wealthy, recently arrived in the neighborhood with opinions about everything, and a waist that hadn't changed since she was 18. He packed his good shirts and his razor, and he told Margaret, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat already on, that she had always been more burden than blessing, and that he expected she'd find a way to manage because women like her always did. Women like her. She had asked him very quietly what he meant by that. He had looked at her the way men look at something they no longer wish to explain, and closed the door behind him. That had been 3 years ago. She had managed. That was the word for it. She had taken in laundry and mended garments, and worked half days at the bakery on Clement Street, where Mrs. Hooper, who was not unkind, but was not particularly interested in kindness, either paid her 70 cents a day to haul flour and wash trays. She had kept her children clothed and more or less fed and enrolled in the school 2 blocks from their building, and she had done it without asking Charles for a cent because Charles had made it abundantly clear through his new wife's attorney that his financial obligations to Margaret were a matter requiring further legal deliberation, which was a way of saying he did not intend to pay them. The courthouse appearance had been Caroline Fitch Dawson's idea. That was what Emily had told her afterward, gathering the information the way 13-year-old girls gather information piece by piece from overheard conversations and the expressions on adult faces. Charles had borrowed money in Margaret's name before he left a detail that Margaret had not known, and could not prove she had not known, and Caroline had engaged a very good attorney who had made the argument, apparently convincingly, that Margaret bore responsibility for the debt. The judge had agreed. 30 days. "Mama!" Emily said on the walk home from the courthouse. "What are we going to do?" Emily was the kind of child who asked that question with her jaw already set, prepared to receive bad news, and immediately begin calculating responses to it. She had been doing that since she was 9, since the year the money first got genuinely tight, and Margaret both loved her for it and grieved for it every single day. A 13-year-old girl should not have her jaw set like that. "We are going to go home," Margaret said, "and you are going to help your sister with her reading, and I am going to think." "About what?" "About what comes next." Sadie, 9 years old and perpetually worried about everything, was holding Margaret's other hand and had been crying quietly since they left the courthouse, not loudly, just leaking the way she did when she didn't want to make things worse. Noah, who was 6, and who had decided somewhere around his 5th birthday to stop talking very much, walked on Sadie's other side, with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the ground. "Noah," Margaret said, "you all right?" He nodded without looking up. "You sure?" He nodded again. She left it there. With Noah, you left things there and waited because pushing never produced anything except more silence, and silence with Noah was at least comfortable in its familiarity. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the newspaper she had been carrying folded in her coat pocket for 3 days without opening. She had picked it up outside the courthouse on a prior visit when she had still believed the outcome might be different, and she had carried it around like a talisman or a joke. She wasn't entirely sure which, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she had already known she might need it. It was a Western paper reprinted in a Chicago collection for the railroads, and it ran advertisements in the back pages from men and enterprises in the territories looking for various services. Most of the advertisements were for workers' ranch hands, cooks, drivers. Some were for businesses seeking investors. And 3 of them on the second to last page were what they used to call marriage advertisements, though the men who placed them rarely used that word directly. 2 of the 3 were for ranchers in Kansas, and 1 was for a man in the Wyoming territory. The Wyoming advertisement was the shortest. It said Rancher 43 Wyoming Territory north of the Bridger Mountains. Seeking capable woman children, welcome no false expectations on either side. Honest work, honest pay, honest life. Write to E. Cole Box, 14 Garnet Creek Post. That was all it said. No description of wealth or property or personal qualities. No promises. Just those few flat sentences that somehow in their flatness communicated something she hadn't encountered in a very long time. She read it 4 times. She looked at the lamp for a while. She listened to Sadie cough once in the next room and settled back into sleep. Then she got up, found a piece of paper and the stub of a pencil she kept in the drawer with the extra buttons, and she sat back down and wrote the most honest sentence she had ever put on paper in her adult life. She wrote, "I am not looking to be rescued. I just need somewhere my children can breathe." She folded it, addressed the envelope, sealed it with the edge of the dampened sponge, and set it on the table. She did not think about it very hard after that, because thinking about it hard would have produced in her a terror sufficient to prevent her from acting, and she had lived long enough to know that thinking hard about things was often just another word for not doing them. His reply came 12 days later. 4 words. "Come if you're certain." She read it standing at the mailbox in the hallway of her building. Mrs. Kowalski from the 2nd floor was coming down the stairs with a basket of laundry and stopped to look at Margaret's face. "Good news?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Margaret said. She told Emily first, because Emily was the one who would need to understand it fully and without softening. She sat her down at the kitchen table after supper, while Sadie and Noah were doing their schoolwork in the other room, and she laid the newspaper advertisement and the reply letter flat on the table between them and waited while Emily read them both. Emily read them twice. Then she looked up. "Wyoming," she said. "Wyoming Territory, north of the Bridger Mountains." "That's far." "Yes." "We don't know him." "That's correct." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Is he dangerous?" "I don't know that either. I know that he has a ranch. I know that he's 43 years old. I know that he said children are welcome, which is more than anyone else has said." "What about school?" "There will be a school. Territories have schools. Emily looked at the letters again. Come if you're certain, she read aloud. What does that mean? I think it means he's been disappointed before, and he doesn't want to spend time on someone who isn't going to follow through. Have other women answered his advertisement? I expect so. And left. Margaret looked at her daughter steadily. I expect so. Emily was quiet again, doing the calculating thing with her face, and then she said, So we'd be going to a ranch in Wyoming to live with a man we don't know who other women have already left. She paused. And we have 30 days before we have to leave here anyway. That's the situation. And you want to go. I didn't say that. Mama. Emily's voice dropped a register. Do you want to go? Margaret sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the street sounds of Chicago moved through the glass. A cart horse, someone arguing the distant clang of something metallic that had fallen. She had been in this city for 22 years, and she had never once felt that it had room for her in it. She had always been too large, too loud, too present, occupying space that other people seemed to feel should belong to someone else. The idea of a place where nobody knew her, where nobody had already decided what she was. I want to find out, she said finally. That's the most honest answer I have. Emily nodded slowly. Then she said, I'll talk to Sadie. I'll talk to Sadie. She's going to cry. She cries about everything. She'll survive. Emily almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd produced in weeks, and Margaret stored it carefully. Sadie did cry, but not for as long as Margaret had expected. She cried for about 10 minutes, and then asked if there would be animals on the ranch. Margaret said she expected so. Sadie wiped her face on her sleeve and said that she had always wanted to see real horses. That was more or less the end of her objections. Noah said nothing when Margaret told him. He sat on the edge of his cot and listened to her explain it very simply that they were leaving Chicago, that they were going to a ranch in Wyoming to live with a man named Mr. Cole, that it was going to be different and hard and maybe good. He listened to all of it, and then he looked at her with his serious, watchful eyes and said, Will there be dogs? I don't know, sweetheart. He nodded as though that was an acceptable answer and went back to looking at his hands. She wrote to Mrs. Hooper at the bakery to say she wouldn't be returning. She settled what she could of her debts with the $31, which left her with $11. She packed 2 suitcases with everything that was genuinely necessary and left the rest the extra curtains, the chair with the broken leg she'd always meant to fix, the small framed picture of her mother that she couldn't fit, and she told herself she would not look back when they walked out the door. She did look back. Once. Then, she faced forward. The train west took 4 days. They ate sparingly because sparingly was all they could afford. Noah slept against Margaret's arm for most of the first 2 days and barely spoke. Sadie counted things out the window, trees, fence posts, the shapes of hills she'd never seen before, and announced each count to no one in particular. Emily read the same book she'd brought 3 times through, which was a habit she had when she was anxious and trying not to appear so. On the 4th evening, when the mountains first appeared in the distance, close enough now to be real, to be solid, Margaret heard Sadie say very quietly, Mama, look. She looked. She didn't say anything. Neither did any of them for a long moment. Are we going there? Sadie asked. Near there? Margaret said. That's where he lives. That's where he lives. Sadie pressed her face to the glass. It's enormous, she said. It goes all the way up. Mountains tend to do that, Emily said from behind her book. I was talking to Mama. I know what you were doing. Girls, Margaret said, and they stopped. But she caught the edge of something on Sadie's face as she turned back to the window. Not fear, not quite. Something closer to wonder. Something that looked for the first time in a long time like a child who had not yet decided to be afraid of what was coming. The wagon that met them at the Garnet Creek station was driven by a man named Pete Grover, who was hired hand on the Cole Ranch, and who had clearly been told to collect a woman and some children, and done a fair job of concealing whatever he'd expected them to look like when he arrived. He tipped his hat to Margaret, said, "Evening, ma'am," with the kind of careful neutrality that people use when they're not sure yet what they're dealing with, and loaded their 2 suitcases into the back without comment. The ride to the ranch was an hour and a half. It was dark by the time they arrived, and cold in the way that Wyoming gets cold, a cold that doesn't ask your opinion about whether you're ready for it. Ethan Cole was standing on the porch when the wagon came up. He was taller than she'd imagined from his words, which was a strange thing to think because she hadn't imagined very much, having decided deliberately not to build expectations that would interfere with reality. He was lean and still in the way of men who have spent a long time working alone and don't move unless there's a reason to. He was wearing a dark coat and his hat was pulled low, and he held a lantern, and he watched the wagon come up the drive without changing his expression. Pete brought the wagon to a stop. Margaret climbed down before he could offer to help her, which was a habit she'd carried for years, getting herself down before anyone could make a performance of assisting her. She heard Emily and Sadie follow behind her, and then the soft thud of Noah dropping from the wagon bed onto the frozen ground. She walked toward Ethan Cole and stopped about 6 feet from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Mrs. Dawson." He glanced past her at the children. His eyes moved over each of them, not unkindly, but with the careful, quiet assessment of a man who was taking inventory. Then he looked back at her. "Long trip," he said. 4 days, she said. "The children held up well." "I expect they did." He looked at Noah, who was standing closest to Margaret, and staring at Ethan with the full, unguarded attention that 6-year-old boys give to things they find interesting. "You the boy," Ethan said. Noah stared at him. "He doesn't talk much," Margaret said evenly. "That's all right," Ethan said. "Neither do I." And he turned and went back inside, holding the door and pausing at the threshold without looking back. "Come in out of the cold," he said. "There's supper on the stove." Margaret looked at Emily. Emily looked at Margaret. Margaret walked through the door. Inside the ranch house was warm from the stove, and it smelled of wood smoke and something that had been cooking for hours, a stew of some kind. The table had been set plainly but completely, 4 places laid with the kind of quiet care that a person shows when they've been alone long enough that company feels like an occasion. There was no ceremony to it, no speech, no introduction to the house or explanation of the arrangement. Ethan Cole ladled stew into bowls and set them on the table and said, "Sit." They sat. He sat at the head of the table and picked up his spoon. Sadie looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. Sadie looked at the stew. She picked up her spoon. She took a bite. She looked up at Ethan Cole and said, "This is really good." Something moved across his face. It was brief and careful, the way certain things surface in people who have kept them below water for a long time, and then it was gone. "Thank you," he said. They ate. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind was beginning to make itself known against the walls. Noah cleaned his bowl without looking up, and then without asking permission, he held it out across the table toward Ethan Cole. Ethan looked at the empty bowl. He looked at Noah. Then he took the bowl, filled it again, and set it back in front of the boy. Noah ate the second bowl just as carefully as the first. Margaret watched all of this without saying anything. She watched Ethan's hands, careful, deliberate, unhurried, and she watched the way he looked at her children when he thought no one was paying attention, which was not the way of a man who resented their presence or was performing patience for her benefit. It was the way of a man who was genuinely trying to remember something he had forgotten. She didn't know what that thing was. She didn't know yet that it would matter. But she remembered it later, sitting at that same table alone after the children had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, and she turned it over in her mind the way you turn over something you found on the ground, unsure of its value, unsure of whether to keep it, not yet willing to set it back down. Ethan Cole came through the kitchen on his way to check the back door, and he paused when he saw her still sitting there. "Couldn't sleep," she said before he could ask. "New place," he said. "Takes time." She looked at him. "Mr. Cole, I want to say this plainly while it's just the 2 of us." He waited. "I am not here because I had a great many choices. I want you to know that I understand exactly what this situation is, and what it isn't. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise or waste your time by behaving like this is something it's not. I'll work hard. My children will work hard. I'll ask nothing from you that wasn't agreed to, and I'll make no demands on your life outside of what's practical. That's what I can promise you." She stopped. "That's all I can promise you." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table surface the way men look at things when they're thinking rather than seeing. "6 women came through that door before you," he said. She had known that, or suspected it. "I know. First one lasted 4 days. Said the isolation was worse than a prison." He paused. "She wasn't wrong about the isolation." He looked up. "Last one lasted 11 days. Said I wasn't what she'd hoped for." Another pause. "She was probably right about that too." Margaret held his gaze. "I'm not here looking for what I hoped for," she said. "I stopped hoping for specific things a long time ago." He studied her for a moment with those dark, level eyes. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He went to check the back door. She sat at the table a little while longer, listening to the wind find the edges of the house and push against them the way wind does when it wants to know what something is made of. She didn't know yet what they were made of, any of them. She didn't know yet what the winter would ask of her, or what this man who barely spoke would demand from the parts of her she'd kept most carefully guarded. She didn't know that her children were even in that first night already beginning to change in ways she wouldn't recognize until she looked back from a place much further on. She knew only this. The door behind her was closed, and she had not locked it, and she had not looked back at it, and the stove was warm, and somewhere in the rooms off the hall, her children were sleeping without hunger for the first time in 4 days. She thought, "That's enough. For tonight, that is enough." She got up, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She was up before the sun. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not that she'd slept late and needed time to find her footing. Not that she'd come downstairs uncertain and slow, the way some people are in a new place, but that by the time he pulled on his coat and came through the kitchen on his way to the barn, the stove was already burning. The coffee was already made, and Margaret Dawson was standing at the counter, working through a sack of flour with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people in difficult circumstances for a very long time. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the left," she said. He poured himself a cup and stood there a moment watching her hands move. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He drank his coffee and went out to the barn. That was how it started. Not with a conversation about expectations or an agreement about roles. Just a woman who got up before dawn and got to work before anyone asked her to, and a man who understood without needing it, explained that this was not performance. This was simply who she was. By the end of the first week, Margaret had reorganized the kitchen into something functional, repaired 3 tears in the curtains with thread she'd found in a tin in the back cupboard, and established a morning routine that produced hot food on the table before Ethan came in from the first round of chores. She didn't ask him what he liked or what he was used to. She observed what he ate without comment and adjusted accordingly. And if there was something she wasn't sure how to handle, the particular temperament of the wood stove, the way the water pump stuck in cold mornings, she figured it out herself, or asked Pete Grover with a directness that made Pete, who was accustomed to people dancing around the things they needed, visibly respect her. The children found their rhythms too, though not without difficulty. Sadie was afraid of almost everything the first week. The sounds the house made at night, the wind, the horses. She'd stand in the barn doorway and refuse to go further, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her face doing the work of someone trying to convince themselves they were not about to cry. Ethan watched this happen on the 3rd morning without saying anything, and then on the 4th morning he came and stood beside her in the doorway. "They can smell it," he said. Sadie looked up at him. "Smell what?" "When you're scared, animals can smell it, and it makes them nervous. So I'm making them nervous. You and every other person who's ever walked into a barn afraid." He paused. "But here's the thing. You breathe slow, They breathe slow. You don't make sudden moves. They don't make sudden moves. You have to be the calm one first, and then they follow. Sadie stared at the nearest horse. The horse stared back. "What if I can't be calm?" she said very quietly. "Then you fake it," Ethan said, "until it stops being fake." He walked past her into the barn without waiting to see if she followed. She stood there for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms, took one deliberate breath, and walked in after him. Margaret, who had been carrying a basket of mending from the house, saw all of this from 30 feet away and said nothing. She simply kept walking and stored it in the same careful place where she'd stored the image of him refilling Noah's bowl. Noah was a different matter entirely. The boy had said exactly 9 words to Ethan in the first week, which Margaret knew because she'd counted, not because she was keeping score, but because with Noah, words were currency, and 9 was already more than he gave most people. On the 6th morning, without anyone suggesting it or giving him direction, Noah simply followed Ethan out to the woodpile and stood there watching while Ethan split wood. Ethan split 3 logs before he acknowledged him. "You want to try?" he said. Noah looked at the axe. He nodded. "It's heavier than it looks." Ethan handed it over both hands, watching the boy's face as he took the weight of it. "You choke up on the handle. Like this." He adjusted Noah's grip from behind his big hands around the boy's smaller ones. "You don't swing with your arms. You swing with your whole body. You let the weight do the work." Noah swung. It was a bad swing. He knew it the way children know the difference between effort and result, but the blade hit the wood and stuck. "Better than I expected," Ethan said. Noah pulled the axe free and handed it back. But he didn't leave. He stayed until Ethan was done, and when Ethan stacked the wood, Noah stacked beside him, matching his placement, not speaking, just working in that parallel quiet that is its own kind of conversation. Margaret watched from the window. She turned away before either of them could see her watching. Emily was the hardest. Emily watched Ethan the way a hawk watches something it hasn't decided about yet. Not with hostility exactly, but with a careful, unblinking attention that most people found uncomfortable, and that Ethan seemed improbably not to notice. Or not to mind. On the 7th day, when Margaret sent Emily out to ask Ethan what time they'd need the wagon ready for the trip to Garnet Creek, Emily came back and reported that she had asked him, and he had answered, and that was that. Margaret asked if he'd said anything else. Emily paused. "He asked me if I liked school." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I used to before everything got complicated." "And?" Another pause. "He said complicated was just another word for real, and real was better than the other kind." Margaret looked at her daughter. Emily looked at the floor. "I don't know what it means," she said in the voice she used when she did know what something meant and wasn't ready to agree with it. "I know," Margaret said. "That's all right." The trip to Garnet Creek for supplies happened on a Thursday, and it was the first time Margaret had been in the company of other people since arriving, and it was as she had expected, as she had been expecting for 20 years, instructive. Garnet Creek was a small town, which meant that a new woman on the Cole Ranch was noticed immediately and assessed almost as quickly. Margaret felt the assessments happening from the moment she stepped down from the wagon, the way you feel weather changing not yet upon you, but undeniably coming. She kept her chin up and her pace steady, and went directly about the business of acquiring what was on the list Ethan had given her. It was Pete Grover who caused the problem, which was not what she'd expected. Pete was not malicious. She'd established that clearly enough in the first week. He was simply a man who said things without considering whether he should, which was its own particular kind of damage. She heard him talking to the man behind the dry goods counter while she was examining a bolt of cloth in the back of the store. She wasn't trying to listen. She just had good ears, and the store was not large. "Surprised she's still there," the counterman said. "Cole's had women come through like bad weather." "She's different," Pete said, with what sounded like genuine consideration. "Works hard, don't complain." "She's a big woman," the counterman said. "Cole's got enough to feed without adding extra at the table." The silence that followed was Pete not finding the right thing to say, which meant he didn't say anything at all. Margaret set down the cloth. She walked to the counter with her list in her hand and her expression completely steady, and she looked directly at the counterman and said, "I'll take everything on this list, please. And when you figure the total, do it right the first time because I'll be checking." He figured it right. She paid. She walked out. Ethan was loading the wagon, and he looked at her face when she came out of the store, and something shifted in his expression, not quite a question, but the shape of one. She handed him the receipt and said, "It's all on there. We're short on salt, so I got extra." "Everything all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. He didn't push. But later, when they were halfway back to the ranch with the children quiet in the wagon bed behind them, he said without looking at her, "People in town say things. About the ranch. About me. I expect some of it carries over." "People say things everywhere," she said. "I know." He kept his eyes on the road. "Doesn't mean it sits easy." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than it had been on the way in. It was the silence of two people who had just told each other something without using very many words, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was in a rush to cover it over with conversation. The twist came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Margaret arrived, and she almost missed it entirely. She had gone to the small back room off the kitchen, a room she'd assumed was for storage, and hadn't entered to look for a second pot she'd seen Pete mention. The room was mostly storage, but along the far wall there was a narrow shelf, and on the shelf between two rusted tins and a folded piece of canvas was a small wooden box. Nothing remarkable about it except that it was the only thing in that room that had been dusted. Recently, deliberately. She didn't open it. She stood in front of it for a moment, understanding without understanding the way you sometimes know a thing before you know it. Then she took the pot she'd come for and left the room and closed the door behind her. That evening after supper, when the children had gone upstairs and she and Ethan were sitting at the table with what remained of the coffee, she said, "You've got a room off the kitchen." He looked at her. "Didn't mean to pry," she said. "I was looking for a pot." "I know," he said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. Then, "My wife was the one who kept that room. After she passed 6 years ago, now I kept it the way she left it. More or less." "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "She had a boy," he said, "before me, from her first husband who died in the war. The boy was 11 when I came into the picture, and he and I didn't have an easy time of it at first, but we got there eventually." He paused. "He's in Colorado now, has his own family. We write sometimes." "Why didn't you tell him about the advertisement?" she asked. Ethan looked at her with a directness that told her it was exactly the right question and that he had not expected it from her quite so plainly. "Because," he said slowly, "I didn't want his opinion coloring mine. You were afraid he'd tell you it was a bad idea." "I was afraid he'd be right," Ethan said. "And I'd have talked myself out of it." Margaret held that. She turned it over. And then she said the thing that had been pressing at the back of her mind for 2 weeks, the thing she'd been carrying since she'd watched him fill Noah's bowl and stand beside Sadie in the barn doorway and adjust her son's hands around the weight of an axe. "Why did you put children welcome in the advertisement?" she said. "The other 2 men I saw advertised, they didn't say that." "Because I meant it," he said. "Most men don't." "I know," he said. "I was the other kind for a while, after Rebecca passed. I told myself I didn't want the complication." He set his mug down. "Then I spent about 4 years in this house by myself, and I understood the difference between complication and life. And one of them I had, and one of them I didn't." The stove ticked. Outside, the wind did what it always did out here. Margaret looked at this man she had known for 2 weeks. This quiet, careful, difficult man, who dusted a small wooden box in a back room and had put 4 words in a letter that changed the entire direction of her life, and she felt something shift inside her that she did not have a name for yet. She was not going to name it. Not tonight. "I'll wash up," she said, and she stood and began clearing the table. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Dawson." She looked at him. "You cooked 2 weeks of good meals in a kitchen that wasn't yours," he said. "I think you can call me Ethan." She looked at him steadily. "Margaret," she said. He nodded. She washed the dishes. He banked the stove. And the house around them settled into its nighttime quiet, with just slightly less distance inside it than there had been the night before. Less emptiness in the rooms, less cold in the silences, less of the particular ache that had lived in those walls for 6 years without a name. Upstairs, Noah was already asleep. Sadie had left a small drawing on the windowsill, something she'd done with a charcoal pencil shapes that were recognizable as a horse. Emily, for the first time since they'd arrived, had not barricaded her door. Margaret stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her children breathe. Then she thought of Ethan's words, the difference between complication and life. She had spent 15 years living in a house where her presence was called the former. She had not known until this moment, standing in a cold hallway in the Wyoming Territory, with the wind against the walls, and her children asleep, what the latter felt like from the inside. It felt like this, exactly like this. Fragile and ordinary, and not yet fully real. She was afraid in the way that hope always makes a person afraid of what it would cost her if it broke. But she did not unlock the door to that fear tonight. She turned it over once and set it aside. She went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could count, she did not lie awake listening for the sound of something going wrong. The good days came first, and that was the cruelest part of it. November brought 3 weeks of hard, clear cold that was manageable, the kind that bit at your ears and stiffened your fingers, but left you functional, left you able to work and eat and sleep without the weather becoming the whole of your existence. The children adapted with a speed that still surprised Margaret every time she thought about it. Sadie was going into the barn on her own now, talking to the horses in a low, steady murmur that Ethan said was better technique than most ranch hands twice her age. Noah had graduated from stacking split wood to helping stack it in the lean-to where it needed to go, shadowing Ethan through the cold mornings, with a focus that said he was learning everything and filing it away. Emily had found a rhythm with her schoolwork and had taken over writing the weekly supply list with a precision that made Pete Grover slightly nervous about getting it wrong. And Margaret and Ethan had arrived quietly and without ceremony at a place that neither of them had named, because naming it felt like a way of testing its weight before they knew how much it could hold. They worked together easily. That was the simplest way to put it. They moved around each other in the kitchen, in the yard, over the planning of the week's tasks, with the kind of practiced ease that usually takes years to develop, and that they had arrived at in a matter of weeks. She finished his sentences about the ranch. He anticipated what she needed in the kitchen and had it ready without being asked. When he thought she was wrong about something, he said so plainly, and she argued back plainly, and they reached conclusions that neither of them would have arrived at alone. When she lay awake some nights turning things over, she was aware that the thing she was most turning over was not fear anymore. It was something that required more careful handling than fear. The storm came on a Thursday in the last week of November, and it came without adequate warning. Pete Grover rode up at mid-morning, looking like a man who had been moving fast and didn't intend to stop long. "You need to hear this," he said to Ethan before he'd even properly dismounted. "Came through the valley this morning and talked to Harlan Briggs. He's been ranching up here 40 years, and he says he hasn't seen a sky like this since the winter of '68, and in '68, 3 families on the North Range didn't make it to spring." Ethan looked at the sky. Margaret, who had come to the porch, looked at Ethan's face, looking at the sky, which was more informative. "How long?" Ethan said. "Briggs said maybe 2 days. Could be tonight." Pete pulled his coat tighter. "I'd get everything inside that you can get inside, and I'd do it now." He was gone 20 minutes later. They worked for the next 6 hours, without stopping, bringing animals into the barn, hauling wood until both of them were breathing hard, checking every latch and every window and every gap where wind could find a way through. Emily organized the kitchen stores without being asked, calling out quantities as she found them. Sadie kept Noah occupied and out of the way, which was its own useful job. Nobody talked about the storm being serious, because the work they were doing communicated that clearly enough. The storm hit at 9 in the evening. It hit like something with a purpose. By midnight, the wind had found every imperfection in the house and was pressing against all of them simultaneously, and the sound of it was unlike anything the children had heard before. Sadie was the first one to come downstairs, not crying, but holding herself very carefully, and she sat at the kitchen table while Margaret made her hot milk, and neither of them said much. Noah appeared 20 minutes later, also not crying, also very careful about it. He sat beside Sadie and put his hand on the table and left it there, and she put hers on top of it. Emily came down last. "It sounds like it's trying to get in," she said. "Houses are built to hold," Margaret told her. "This one's been here 30 years. It'll hold tonight." She believed it when she said it. She believed it the next day and the day after that. What she had not factored, what none of them had fully factored, was how long the storm intended to stay. By the end of the fourth day, the snow was to the second step of the porch, and the temperature had dropped to something that made the cold of the first weeks feel nostalgic. The road to Garnet Creek was gone, not passable with difficulty, but gone obliterated, as if the territory had simply decided to revoke the concept of roads until further notice. Pete had not been back. The supplies in the kitchen were adequate but not generous, and Margaret had begun adjusting portions without announcing it, which Emily noticed on the second day, and said nothing about, which meant she understood. On the sixth day, Noah woke up coughing. It was the kind of cough that starts as something dismissible, a dry scratch in the throat. The kind children get when the air is too cold and too dry, and Margaret told herself that on the first morning and the second morning, and into the afternoon of the second day. She told herself that while she felt his forehead and found it warm. She told herself that while she made him broth and made him stay in bed and sat beside him longer than she'd intended because she couldn't make herself leave. She told herself that right up until the evening of the second day, when his temperature climbed past warm into something else entirely, and she pressed the back of her hand to his face and felt the heat coming off him like a coal in a stove. "Ethan," she said. She said it at the door of the barn where he was with the animals. She said it in a voice she did not recognize as her own. He came in from the cold, already reading her face. He looked at her, then past her at the house. "Noah. He's got a fever. It's high." She pressed her lips together. "I need to know what you have here. Medicine. What do you have?" "Willow bark. Some dried herbs Rebecca kept." "I'll look." He looked. What they had was not enough, and they both knew it within 10 minutes of looking. "There's a clinic in Garnet Creek," Margaret said. Her voice was doing something she was working to control. "Dr. Avery, he'd have quinine, he'd have something that would actually—" "The road is gone," Ethan said. "I know the road is gone." "Margaret." He said her name the way people say things when they need you to hear the whole truth of what they're about to tell you. "It's not just snow. The drifts on the north side of the pass will be 10 feet in some places. A horse going through that in the dark in this wind." "I know." She turned away from him. She pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and held onto it and tried to breathe through the thing that was rising in her chest, the thing that had been rising for 2 days and that she had been holding down with every ounce of what she had. She held it down now. She breathed. She breathed again. And then from upstairs came Noah's voice, small, cracked, unfamiliar with sickness, saying, "Mama." The thing rose all the way up. She did not make a sound. She simply walked to the bottom of the stairs and gripped the post there and stood with her back to Ethan, and the sound she did not make was in every muscle of her body, in the way her shoulders were working to contain it. "Tell me," Ethan said from behind her. His voice was quiet. Not careful the way people are careful when they're managing someone. Quiet the way people are quiet when they mean it. "Don't," she said. "Margaret, don't do that." Her voice came out in pieces. "Don't stand there don't be kind right now, because if you're kind right now, I am going to." "I know," he said, and something about the simplicity of it. 2 words, no performance. Just "I know," spoken like a man who had sat with impossible things himself and understood that there was no solving them, broke the last of what she'd been holding. She turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen, and she said it, the thing she had never said out loud to another living person. The thing she had carried alone through 15 years of marriage and the dissolution of that marriage and 3 children, and every humiliation, and every debt, and every courthouse, and every locked door. She said it in a voice that barely held together. "I lost a baby," she said, "before Noah. He was 3 weeks old. I woke up one morning and he was just gone. No warning, no reason. The doctor said sometimes it happens, and there was nothing anyone could have done, and Charles said—" She stopped, started again. "Charles said it was probably for the best, given our situation, and I never told anyone what that did to me. What it has been doing to me every single day since then." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "And now I'm standing in the middle of a blizzard in Wyoming with a sick child, and I cannot lose another one. I cannot. And everywhere I go, Ethan, everywhere I go, and everything I touch—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he stood in front of her, not touching her, just standing in front of her, with the full weight of his attention on her face, and he said in the flattest and most certain voice she had ever heard a human being use, "That is not true." She shook her head. "Listen to me." His voice didn't rise. It didn't soften either. It just stayed absolutely level, the way a man's voice stays level when he has thought something through completely and is certain of what he's about to say. "You have 3 children upstairs. They are alive, and they are fed, and they are here. That is not an accident, Margaret. That is you. Every day for years that has been you." He stopped. Then he said the rest of it. "Your children are not burdens, and neither are you. I need you to hear that." She heard it. She heard it in a way that she had not been heard in so long that it felt like a foreign language she'd forgotten she once knew. And she stood in his kitchen in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, and she cried. Not quietly, not carefully. In the ugly total way that people cry when they have been not crying for a very long time. He let her. When it was done, she pulled herself back together with the practical, determined speed of a woman who was not in the habit of staying down long. She wiped her face. She straightened her back. She looked at him. "I need medicine for my son," she said. "I know you do," he said. "The road. I'll go around the North Pass. There's a lower route. Longer but more sheltered. I've done it before." He was already moving toward his coat, his gloves, his things. "Ethan!" She caught his arm. "It's the middle of the night. The temperature out there will kill a horse." "Fancy's a tough animal," he said without stopping. "She's done worse than this. This is not, you cannot go out there alone in this storm for my son." He stopped. He turned around. He looked at her with an expression that she would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately describe and never quite manage, not quite determination, not quite tenderness, but something that lived in the space where those two things meet and refuses to move. "Stay with him," he said. "Keep him warm. The willow bark will help some. I'll be back before morning." "Ethan!" "Margaret." He put his hat on. "Stay with your boy." And he walked out the door into the storm. She stood in the kitchen for 5 seconds, listening to the sound of him crossing the porch. Then she was already moving up the stairs into the room where Noah lay burning with fever, where she sat on the edge of his cot and gathered him against her side and held him with both arms and began to talk to him. She talked to keep him conscious and herself grounded. She told him stories, small ones, things she made up on the spot, stories about horses and mountain trails, and a man who was riding through the snow to bring something back. She talked until her voice went rough, and she kept talking after that. Emily appeared in the doorway an hour in. "Is Mr. Cole coming back?" she said. The calculation was gone from her voice. She was just a 13-year-old girl asking the only question that mattered. Margaret looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said with a certainty she had no grounds for and chose to possess entirely. "He's coming back." Emily came in and sat on the other side of Noah without another word. Sadie appeared 15 minutes later and sat on the floor by the cot and put her hand on Noah's foot and kept it there. They waited. The storm pressed against the house. The stove below kept the cold from becoming absolute. Noah breathed ragged and too fast, but breathing, and Margaret counted his breaths the way she had counted Emily's words about Ethan. The way she counted everything that mattered carefully privately, because counting was the only form of control she had right now, and she would take it. 2 hours. 3. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing. Hooves on frozen ground, then on the porch boards, then a door, then boots. Then his voice from the bottom of the stairs, rough with cold but intact. Margaret. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She was at the top of the stairs, and then halfway down them, and he was there, snow-covered, half-frozen, moving slower than he'd gone out, but standing upright alive, and he held up a cloth bag with his stiff hands. "Dr. Avery was in," he said. "Gave me what you need." She took the bag. She looked at him, at what the ride had cost him, at the frost on his coat, and the way he was working to keep his hands steady, and she felt something settle into place inside her that was not relief exactly, or not only relief. She had thought 2 hours ago when he walked out the door that if he came back, she would know she was grateful. That was all she'd expected. Gratitude. Standing at the bottom of the stairs with medicine in her hands, and this man in front of her, she understood that what she felt was not gratitude. Gratitude was for what someone gave you. What she felt was for who he was. For the fact that when her son got sick in a blizzard in the middle of the night in the Wyoming Territory, this man saddled his horse and rode 4 hours through a storm without being asked twice. Not because he was obligated, not because of any arrangement or advertisement or 4-word letter, but because he had decided somewhere in the previous weeks that her children were his concern, that she was his concern, and having decided it, he did not waver. "Ethan," she said. "Go take care of your boy," he said. She went, but she looked back once, just once, at the foot of those stairs, and the look she gave him said everything she did not yet have words for, and he received it without moving, and that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. She mixed the medicine with warm water and got it into Noah, and by the time the sky outside was beginning to shift from black to gray, his fever had started slowly and stubbornly to come down. She sat beside him with her back against the wall and her daughter leaning against her shoulder, and she let herself for the first time in that long night close her eyes. Noah got out of bed on his own on the 8th day. Margaret heard him before she saw him. The soft, deliberate sound of small feet on the floor above, moving carefully, but moving which was different from the sound of a child who was sick, and different from the sound of a child who was staying down out of caution. She was at the bottom of the stairs, before she had consciously decided to go there, and he appeared at the top, dressed hair, uncombed, looking pale and thin and absolutely determined. "I want to go outside," he said. She wanted to tell him it was too cold, that he needed another day at least, that Dr. Avery's instructions had said rest and warmth and more rest. She looked at his face. She looked at the particular quality of the determination there, the same look he'd had at 6 years old, when he'd decided to stop talking so much, the kind of decision a child makes that you cannot argue your way around, because it has already been made at a level deeper than argument. 10 minutes, she said. Coat, hat, boots, and you stay on the porch. He was dressed and down the stairs in 4 minutes. She watched from the window. He stood on the porch in the cold Wyoming morning, and he tipped his face up and breathed it in. All of it, the cold, the clean air, the particular silence of the mountains after a storm. And something in the set of his small shoulders said that he understood, in the wordless way, that children sometimes understand things exactly how close it had come. He stood there for his 10 minutes. Then he came back inside and sat at the kitchen table and ate everything Margaret put in front of him, which was the most words he had spoken to her in a week. What Margaret did not know until that evening was that Ethan had been on the porch too, around the corner on the north side, doing something with a length of rope that could have waited. That he'd stayed out there the whole 10 minutes. That when Noah turned to come back inside, Ethan had said very quietly, "Good man," and Noah had said nothing, but had stopped for just a moment before he came through the door in the way a person stops when something they needed to hear has finally reached them. She found this out from Pete Grover, who had seen it and who told her without fully understanding why he was telling her, which meant it was the truest kind of account. She thought about it for a long time. She also thought about what happened 3 days later when Ethan himself went down. He would not have admitted it was coming. That was the thing about men who ride 4 hours through a Wyoming blizzard in the dead of winter. They do not generally volunteer that the ride has cost them something. But on the third morning after Noah came downstairs, Ethan did not come in from the early chores at the usual time, and when Margaret went to look for him, she found him in the barn sitting on a hay bale, with his head back against the wall, and his eyes closed, and his color all wrong. "Don't," he said before she'd spoken. "You've got a fever," she said. "It'll pass." Ethan Cole. She said it the way she said things when they were not open for discussion. "Get inside." He got inside. He didn't do it easily or gracefully, and he made it clear at every step that he considered this an inconvenience rather than a necessity. But he got inside, and she put him in the chair nearest the stove with a blanket, and made him drink something hot, and watched him with the same patient, steady attention she'd given Noah for 8 days, which brooked no argument because it was not an argument. It was a fact. "You're not sick," he said somewhere in the middle of the second day of this. "That's correct," she said. "You had the same cold nights, same drafts." "I'm harder to knock over than I look," she said without turning from the stove. Something shifted in his expression. She heard it in the quality of his silence, which was different from his regular silence. "Margaret," he said. "Drink the rest of it," she said. "I was going to say thank you." She turned around and looked at him. Then this man who had told her she was not a burden in the middle of a blizzard, who had ridden out in the dark for her son, who was now sitting in his own kitchen with a blanket over his shoulders, looking genuinely uncertain whether gratitude was a thing he was allowed to offer her. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "You're welcome. Drink the rest of it." He drank the rest of it. He was back on his feet in 4 days, which she attributed to the constitution of a man who had been living hard outdoors for 20 years, and he was characteristically unsentimental about the whole episode the moment it was over. But something had shifted between them in those 4 days, and they both knew it, and neither of them made the mistake of trying to identify it out loud and risk diminishing it. Spring in Wyoming comes the way most good things come later than you hoped, and then all at once, and with a force that makes you wonder how you forgot it was possible. The world changed. The children changed with it. Emily enrolled in the school at Garnet Creek, and rode in with Pete Grover on supply days, which she handled with the same organized self-sufficiency she brought to everything. She was there 3 weeks before Margaret heard anything significant, and what she heard came from Pete, who had it from the schoolteacher Mrs. Caldwell, who had seen it herself. There was a girl in Emily's class named Ruth who was 12 and who was small, and who had the kind of difference about her that children in schoolyards identify and act on. Emily had watched it happen for 2 weeks without acting in the calculating way she had, and then on a Thursday she had apparently decided she'd done enough watching. She stood up in the middle of the schoolyard in front of 6 children who were significantly louder and more numerous than Ruth, and she said clearly, and without raising her voice, that the next person who spoke to Ruth that way would answer to her, and that she had 3 years of experience handling things considerably harder than a schoolyard, and she was not interested in making friends with people who mistook cruelty for entertainment. The schoolyard went quiet. Mrs. Caldwell, observing from the doorway, had chosen not to intervene. When Margaret heard this, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said to Pete, "Is Ruth all right?" "Right as rain," Pete said. "Follows Emily around now like a shadow." Margaret thought about her daughter, 13 years old, carrying weight no child should carry. Standing up in a strange schoolyard in Wyoming, for a girl she barely knew, using words that were entirely her own. She thought about where those words had come from. She thought about what it means when a child who has been through the things Emily had been through decides to use what she's learned to protect somebody else instead of just herself. She went and found Ethan in the yard and told him. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "That's a good girl you've got." "I know," Margaret said. "She learned that somewhere." Margaret looked at him. "She learned some of it from you," she said. He started to deny it and then stopped himself, which was progress. Sadie planted flowers that spring. She asked Ethan first very formally whether she was allowed to use the ground along the south side of the house, and he said she could use whatever ground she wanted, which produced in Sadie an expression of such complete satisfaction that even Pete Grover, who was not a particularly sentimental man, smiled at it. She planted what she could get from the dry goods store in Garnet Creek, and supplemented with things she found along the creek bank, wild things small and hardy, the kind that had been surviving Wyoming winters on their own for centuries. By June, the south side of the house had color. One morning, Ethan crouched down beside her while she was working and looked at what she'd planted. "That one's going to take over everything else if you let it go," he said, pointing at something near the edge. "I know," Sadie said. "I like it. It's persistent." He looked at her. "Where'd you get that word?" "Mama says it's the most important thing a person can be." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mama's right," he said, and stood back up and went back to work. Sadie pressed a small flower into the dirt and patted the soil around it carefully, and did not say what she was thinking, which was that the most persistent thing she knew personally was not her mother, but was standing about 20 feet away, pretending to check a fence post. Noah, meanwhile, had stopped following Ethan at a distance and begun working directly beside him. Not helping exactly, not always at Ethan's level of competence or usefulness, but present, attentive, and increasingly capable. Ethan had taught him to read the weather from the behavior of the horses. He had taught him which wood burned long and which burned fast, and why it mattered. He had taught him how to cinch a saddle correctly the first time, so you didn't have to do it twice. And Noah had listened to all of it with the focused, total seriousness that he brought to everything, and had absorbed it in the way children absorb things when they feel genuinely safe, completely without reservation. He called Ethan by his first name, which was what Ethan had told him to do. But once in late April, when they were coming in from the far pasture and the light was going, Margaret heard Noah say something she couldn't quite catch, and she heard Ethan's response, which was a single word spoken very quietly, and when Noah walked past her, she looked at his face, and whatever she saw there, she kept entirely to herself. She kept a lot of things to herself that spring. What she could not keep to herself indefinitely was the letter that arrived on a Friday morning in the second week of May, addressed to her, bearing a return address from a law office in Chicago that she recognized immediately because it was the same office that had handled Charles's case at the courthouse in the winter. She opened it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it flat on the table and sat with both hands in her lap and breathed. The letter said that Charles Dawson, acting on behalf of himself and his wife Caroline, was pursuing legal recourse to modify the terms of care for Emily Sadie and Noah Dawson, on the grounds that their mother had removed them from their home state without proper notification, had placed them in an irregular domestic arrangement with a man to whom she was not married, and that the conditions of their upbringing were therefore potentially improper. It said they had 30 days to respond. It said in language designed to sound procedural and reasonable that her children could be taken. Ethan came in from the yard and found her sitting there. He read her face in the way he had learned to read it. He looked at the letter on the table. She nodded once. He sat down and read it. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw set. She watched him get very still in the specific way he got still when he was working through something completely before he said a word. She had seen that stillness when Pete brought the storm warning. She had seen it the night he made the decision to ride for medicine. It was not the stillness of a man deciding whether to act. It was the stillness of a man deciding how. "He doesn't want the children," he said. He said it with certainty, not as a question. "No," Margaret said. "He never did. This is Caroline. She wants to make my life difficult enough that I come back to Illinois, settle the original debt on her terms, and disappear quietly. And if you don't, then it gets drawn out and expensive, and she assumes I can't afford either." Ethan set the letter down. "Can you?" he said. "No," she said flatly. "I cannot afford an attorney in Chicago from Wyoming on what I have." He was quiet for exactly 7 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "I can." She looked at him. "I've got a land sale from 2 years ago that I haven't touched," he said. "I was going to use it for the north pasture fence. The fence can wait." "Ethan?" "Margaret." He said it with the same flat, non-negotiable certainty he'd used in the blizzard. "Those are your children. Nobody is taking them." She sat very still. "You'd do that," she said, "for children that aren't yours." He looked at her steadily. "I'd do it for children that are mine," he said, "if you'll allow it." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. She allowed it. He rode to Garnet Creek the following Monday and spoke to Judge Aldrich, who knew Ethan Cole as a man of 30 years' honest standing in the territory, and who listened to the situation with the careful attention of someone who understood that letters from Chicago law offices were not always what they presented themselves to be. He also spoke to an attorney in Cheyenne by telegraph, and the response that came back said clearly that removal of children across state lines was legal in circumstances of financial hardship, with a good faith effort to provide adequate care, and that the conditions at the Cole Ranch documented and witnessed constituted precisely that. The letter that went back to Chicago bore the attorney's name and the judge's endorsement, and said in language that left no room for procedural ambiguity that the matter was closed. Charles Dawson did not write again. It was 3 weeks after this. 3 weeks in which neither Ethan nor Margaret spoke directly about what it had meant, in which they continued to work alongside each other and feed each other's children and sit at the same table and share the same silences, that Margaret noticed what Ethan had been doing in the barn. She had thought he was working on the north pasture fence material. She had thought the hours he spent in the barn in the evenings were about the horses or equipment, or the dozen other practical demands of ranch life that she hadn't yet fully learned to track. She had not gone to look because she had learned over months that Ethan worked best without an audience, and she respected it. But on an evening in early June, one of the children's cats got into the barn, and Sadie went after it and came back inside with her eyes wide and said, "Mama, you need to see what he's done." She went. He had framed and floored the loft into 3 separate spaces. Not large, not finished, but real proper rooms, each with a window. He'd cut each sized for a child, rather than storage, each with a small shelf built into the wall that hadn't existed before. He'd put down pine board on the floors and stretched canvas on the frames to keep the worst of the drafts out. And in the corner of what was clearly intended as Noah's space, she knew, because it faced the pasture where the horses were, he had put up 2 wooden pegs for hanging things at exactly the height a 6-year-old could reach. She stood in the middle of it. She did not say anything for a long time. Ethan appeared at the top of the loft ladder. He looked at her and did not look away. "When did you start this?" she said. "February," he said. "After the blizzard." She thought about that. "You started building them rooms before you knew we were staying." "I knew you were staying," he said. "You couldn't have known that." "I knew it when Noah held out his bowl the first night," he said. "And I knew it when you told me you weren't looking to be rescued." He paused. People who are going to run say things like that to make themselves feel better about running. People who mean to stay say it because it's true. She looked at the peg on the wall at Noah's height. "You put that at exactly the right height," she said. "I measured," he said. She pressed her lips together hard. She breathed through her nose once steadily. Then she said, "Why, Ethan? Why did you do all this?" He came down 2 rungs of the ladder and stopped there, which put them at the same level, and he said it the way he said the things he meant most plainly, without performance, without decoration. "Because kids deserve roots," he said, "and these 3 have been pulled up enough." They finished the fence on the south pasture in the last week of June. It was a long, hot afternoon, and they worked at it together. The way they worked at everything, without wasted motion, without unnecessary conversation, with the particular ease of people who have been through something hard together and come out knowing the shape of each other. The sun was going down. They were on the last section. Ethan had been quiet for the past hour in a way that was different from his regular quiet, heavier, more deliberate, the way a man is quiet when he is carrying a question that he is about to stop carrying. He set the last post. He tested it. He put his hands in his pockets. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. He did not get down on one knee. He did not reach for anything. He looked at her with those dark, level, honest eyes, and he asked her the only question that had ever really mattered between them, asked it in 4 words the same way he had answered her first letter in 4 words, because he was a man who said the thing he meant, and no more. "You staying," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at this man who had made bedrooms for her children in February, who had ridden through a blizzard for her son, who had spent his own money to protect her family from a threat that was not his problem, and had never been his obligation. She looked at the man who said, "Good man," to a 6-year-old boy on a cold porch, so quietly that the boy almost didn't hear it. She looked at the man who had told her she was not a burden in the plainest voice she had ever heard, and had not taken it back in the months since. She felt tears come, and did not try to stop them. "Forever," she said. He nodded once the way he nodded when something was settled. Then he picked up his tools. She picked up hers. They walked back to the house together through the long evening light, and from the porch Sadie called something about supper, and Noah was already at the door, and Emily appeared beside Sadie, and shaded her eyes and watched them come in from the pasture, and something in Emily's face, in the set of it, in the way the calculation had finally eased out of it, said that she saw it. All of it. That she understood what was walking toward her from that pasture, and that she was not afraid of it anymore. The house was warm. Supper was ready. They all sat down. They were married on a Saturday in July, 6 months after Margaret said forever at the fence line, and the wedding was exactly what both of them were plain certain, and without any element designed for show. Judge Aldrich rode out from Garnet Creek. Pete Grover stood beside Ethan in his good shirt that he had ironed himself badly and did not apologize for. Emily stood beside Margaret in the dress she'd worn to the courthouse in Chicago, which fit her differently now. Not because she had changed shape, but because the person wearing it had, and that changes the way clothing sits on a body in ways that have nothing to do with seams. Sadie held a small bunch of the flowers she'd grown along the south wall. Noah stood next to Ethan and did not fidget, which was the most formal thing about the whole proceeding. Judge Aldrich asked the necessary questions. They answered them. He pronounced them married. Pete shook Ethan's hand and said, "About time," in a tone that suggested he'd been thinking it for months. Sadie gave Margaret the flowers. Emily looked at her new stepfather for a long moment, and then said quietly and directly, "You'd better not make her regret it." Ethan looked at her with the complete seriousness the statement deserved. "I don't intend to," he said. Emily nodded once. The matter was settled. Margaret laughed for the first time that day, a real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere low and warm, and Ethan looked at the sound of it, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for, without knowing. He was waiting. They ate supper. They went back to work the next morning because the ranch did not care about Saturdays or ceremonies, and neither did the animals. But something had been named now, something that had existed for months in the unnamed space between them, and naming it changed the air inside the house in ways that were small and significant and permanent. The first person arrived in September. Her name was Clara Marsh. She was 37 years old. She had 2 boys under 10, and she arrived at the edge of the Cole property on a horse that was not going to survive another winter, leading a wagon that had a broken rear axle she'd repaired herself, with wire and prayer somewhere back on the Bridger Road. She had heard, she said, from a woman in Garnet Creek, who had heard from Pete Grover, who had heard from no one he could clearly remember, that the Cole Ranch sometimes had room. Pete had not said this. Margaret had not said this. No one had said this officially or formally, or on any occasion anyone could specifically recall. But Clara Marsh had heard it anyway, the way people hear things that they need to be true, because the alternative is that there is nowhere left to go. Margaret found her at the edge of the property at dusk, talking to the horse, in a low, urgent voice that was more prayer than speech. She took one look at the broken axle and the 2 boys asleep against each other in the wagon bed, and the expression on Clara's face, which was the expression of a woman who had exhausted every option except this one, and she said, "Come in out of the cold. There's supper." She told Ethan after Clara and the boys were inside and eating. He stood in the yard and listened to her explain it. Then he said, "How long does she need?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to ask me why I brought her in without telling you first." He picked up the tool he'd set down to listen to her. "You already know the answer to that," he said. "You don't need me to say it." She did know the answer. The answer was that he trusted her judgment the way she trusted his, completely without reservation, as the result of months of evidence rather than hope. She went back inside. Clara Marsh stayed through the winter. By spring, she had found work in Garnet Creek at the post office, which suited her particular combination of organization and determination exactly, and she rented a room in town for herself and the boys. But she came back to the ranch on Sundays, and she brought whoever needed a meal or a few hours away from their own circumstances, and it started. The way most significant things start, without anyone declaring that it was starting. The second family arrived in November of that year. The third came in the following February. By the time the snow melted in the third spring of Margaret and Ethan's marriage, there was a rhythm to it, a coming and going of people who had been told by word of mouth along a chain that no one person had organized that the Cole Ranch had room for people who needed room. Margaret ran it the way she ran everything practically honestly, without sentiment that interfered with function. She knew what the ranch could absorb, and she knew what it could not, and she made those decisions with the directness that had always been her clearest quality. She asked things of the people she took in work honesty, and the willingness to leave when they were ready and return when they needed to. She did not ask for gratitude. She did not ask for their stories before she'd fed them. She did not ask them to be anything other than what they were, which was people who had run out of doors and found one still open. Ethan built. That was what he did while she managed the people. He built space for them, the same way he had built the loft for her children, with the same quiet, deliberate care. A bunkhouse addition. A second cooking area. A proper room for a family that needed walls, and a door and the particular dignity of a space that was theirs alone. Pete Grover complained regularly that he hadn't signed on to be a construction crew and worked every job alongside Ethan without being asked. People in Garnet Creek had opinions about it, as they had opinions about everything. Some of those opinions were generous. Some were not. The ones that were not tended to diminish after the first time someone who'd held them found themselves in circumstances they hadn't anticipated, and arrived at the Cole Ranch at dusk with children and a broken wagon axle and found the door open. There was an afternoon in the second summer, a day in town at the dry goods store, when the man behind the counter made a remark. He was a different man than the one who had made the remark 3 years before, but the category of remark was familiar enough. He said it under his breath to the woman beside him, in the way people say things they think won't carry. It carried. Margaret set her purchases on the counter and looked at him and said in a voice that the entire store heard clearly, "I've been listening to men with opinions about how much space I'm allowed to occupy for 40 years, and I've come to the conclusion that the men with those opinions are never as large as they think they are, or as important. Add those up and tell me what I owe." He added them up. He told her. She paid. She walked out. In the wagon on the way home, Ethan said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You all right?" "Better than all right," she said, and she meant it. For the first time in 44 years, she meant it entirely. Emily left in October of that year. She had written to a school in Cheyenne that trained people for social work, a new word for an old practice, caring for families in crisis through official channels, and they had accepted her based on her letter, which was the most precise, well-argued, and unsentimental document. The director of the school said he'd read in 10 years of accepting applications. She told Margaret at breakfast. She said it plainly the way Margaret had taught her to say difficult things directly with the necessary information without drama that didn't serve the facts. Margaret put her coffee cup down. "When?" she said. 3 weeks, Emily said. The silence at the table had weight. Noah said, "Will you come back for Christmas?" Emily said. "And summers if I can." Noah looked at his plate. He nodded once, the gesture he'd inherited from Ethan, that particular economy of movement that said a thing was heard and acknowledged, and that the speaker was trusted. Ethan said, "You need money for the train." "I have some saved," Emily said. "You'll need more than some," he said. "I'll give you the difference." Emily looked at him. She was 19 years old, and she had the kind of face that had always been older than its years, and in that moment she looked exactly her age, young and grateful, and trying not to show either too plainly. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't," he said. He picked up his coffee cup. "I'm doing it anyway." Margaret recognized those words. She looked at the table to keep her face from doing what it wanted to do. The morning Emily left, Margaret held her at the wagon for a long time without speaking. Emily, who had not been a demonstrative child and was not a demonstrative young woman, held back with equal silence and equal force. "You taught me to be this," Emily said finally against her shoulder. "You were already this," Margaret said. "I just kept you alive long enough for you to figure it out." Emily pulled back. She looked at her mother, at this woman who had dragged 3 children across a country with $31 and 2 suitcases and an honest sentence in a letter, and she said, "I used to be so angry at you, for not fixing things faster, for not making it easier." "I know," Margaret said. "I was wrong," Emily said. "You were 13, Margaret said. 13 is supposed to be wrong about some things." Emily almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd produced in the kitchen in Chicago the night Margaret told them about Wyoming, and it still looked the same, not quite a smile too specific for that, the expression of someone acknowledging a truth they find unexpectedly bearable. Then she climbed up into the wagon beside Pete, and Pete clicked to the horse and the wagon went up the drive. Margaret watched it go. Ethan came and stood beside her. He did not put his arm around her or say anything consoling, because he knew she didn't want consolation. He just stood beside her, which was what she needed, and she stood beside him, which was what he needed, and they watched the wagon until it was gone. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in November, 2 years after Emily left. It bore a Chicago postmark. Margaret recognized the handwriting on the envelope only because she had seen it once before on a document at the courthouse. Precise, upright, a woman's hand that was accustomed to meaning exactly what it wrote. Caroline Fitch Dawson. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table. She read it standing up because she hadn't thought to sit down. Charles had died in March. A stroke. He had left debts that Caroline had not known about, business arrangements that had gone quietly wrong over years while he presented a different surface to the world. The house was gone. The attorney's office was gone. Caroline was living in 2 rooms on the north side of the city, where the walls were thin and the rent was due on the 1st of every month. She wrote none of this as complaint. She wrote it as fact in that precise hand with the same economy that characterized legal documents. And then, she wrote the thing that had taken her, she said, 11 drafts to put into words. She wrote, "I was not kind to you. I told myself it was necessary, and then I told myself it was justified. And then I stopped telling myself anything, because thinking about it was uncomfortable. I found a box of your letters in Charles's desk after he died. Letters you wrote him when you were young before everything. I read them. I should not have read them. I am writing to tell you that I read them because I think you deserve to know that someone who was not kind to you has seen clearly and too late what they were unkind to. I am not asking for anything. I thought you should know." Margaret read it twice. She sat down. She sat at that table for a long time, turning the letter over in her hands, thinking about the particular quality of what she felt, which was not triumph, not vindication, not satisfaction, in the way she might have imagined years ago when she'd sat in a courthouse and watched Caroline smile at her with gloves on. What she felt was older and quieter than any of those things. It was closer to a door finally closing, not slamming, just closing. Ethan came in from the yard and saw her face and the letter and sat down across from her without asking anything. She handed it to him. He read it. He set it on the table and waited. "I'm going to write back," she said. "All right," he said. "I'm going to tell her that if she has nowhere to go, she can come here." She looked at him directly. "I need you to know that before I do it." He met her eyes. In 9 years of marriage, she had learned to read his silences, the way he had learned to read her voice, And what this silence said was, I already knew you were going to say that, and I already know what I think about it. Margaret, he said. She tried to take my children, she said steadily. I know that. And she's a woman alone in 2 rooms in Chicago with thin walls and rent due on the first, and I know what that is. I know exactly what that is. Ethan looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. You're a better person than she deserved, he said. Maybe, she said. But this isn't about what she deserves. It's about what I can live with. He nodded once. She wrote the letter. Caroline did not come. She wrote back 3 weeks later to say that she had found a situation in the city and was managing, and that she was grateful for the offer in a way she did not have adequate words for, which was itself a kind of honesty Margaret could respect. They wrote occasionally after that. Not warmly, not as friends, but as 2 women who had been on opposite sides of the same difficult life and had arrived by entirely different routes at a place where cruelty no longer served either of them. It was Sadie who started the school. She had been teaching informally for 2 years already. The children who came through the ranch, and then the children of the families who'd stayed in Garnet Creek, and then whoever showed up with questions and time on their hands before anyone suggested she ought to make it official. Judge Aldrich's wife was the one who suggested it. She came to Margaret with the idea in the spring, and Margaret said, "Tell Sadie, it's her school." Mrs. Aldrich told Sadie, who listened with the same careful attention she'd given every horse in the barn, and said she'd need a proper building and the right books, and she'd need to know the county would support it. The county said they would. The building went up in the fall. Sadie taught in it for 31 years. Noah did not leave. This was not because he lacked choices or opportunity. It was because Noah Cole, he had taken the name quietly without ceremony when he was 15. The same way he did most significant things, understood exactly what the ranch was and what it required, and chose to give it what it required. He worked beside Ethan through his teens and into his 20s, and he learned everything there was to learn. And when Ethan's knee went bad in Noah's 23rd year, and he couldn't work the east pasture anymore, Noah worked it without being asked and without making a performance of the fact that he was now carrying what Ethan had carried. He was not talkative. He had never been talkative. But he had a quality about him that the people who came to the ranch remarked on consistently: a steadiness, a way of being present with someone in difficulty that did not require much language. He could sit beside a frightened child and not say anything, and the child would calm. He could walk into a room where something was wrong, and the temperature of the room would change. Margaret knew where he had learned it, and it was not from her. And she watched Noah and Ethan work together on a cold morning, and thought that is what a man becomes when someone shows him what it costs to stay. The winter when Margaret was 61 years old came the way Wyoming winters always came, without asking anyone's opinion about the timing. She sat on the porch in the early evening, with a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of something warm in her hands, and Ethan beside her, in the chair that had been his chair for 20 years, and they watched the mountains do what mountains do in November. She had not thought about the courthouse in a long time. She had not thought about the 2 suitcases, or the $11, or the dry goods counterman, or the letter from Chicago, or the 30 days to vacate. She had not been thinking about any of it. She'd been thinking about Sadie's last letter, which said the school had 18 students this term. She'd been thinking about Emily, who had written that she was coming for Christmas and was bringing a friend, which Emily never did, which meant the friend mattered. She'd been thinking about Noah, who had fed the horses this morning, and would feed them tomorrow morning, and would feed them the morning after that, consistent and quiet as the mountains themselves. She'd been thinking about the woman she'd been in that Chicago kitchen, reading a 4-word telegram by lamplight at 2 in the morning. "Ethan," she said. He said. "Do you remember what you wrote to me in the letter? Those 4 words." He was quiet for a moment. "Come if you're certain," he said. "I wasn't certain," she said. "Not even close." "I know," he said. "I could tell from your letter." She turned to look at him. "You could tell. Woman who was certain wouldn't have needed to explain she wasn't looking to be rescued," he said. "Certain people don't have to explain what they're not. They just come." He looked at her sideways. "You were scared half to death and you came anyway. That's better than certain. She thought about that. She sat with it the way she sat with the things that mattered fully without hurry. You knew that, and you still wrote back, she said. I wrote back because of the other sentence, he said, about somewhere your children could breathe. He shifted in his chair. Couldn't say no to that. The mountains held the last light and then let it go. Somewhere behind them in the house, footsteps moved from one room to another. Noah, or one of the families staying in the bunkhouse, or Pete's nephew, who helped with the cattle, now that Pete's back had made him a better supervisor than ranch hand. The sounds of a house that had people in it. The sounds of a life that had decided it was large enough to hold whatever needed holding. Margaret had spent 40 years being told she was too much. Too large, too loud, too damaged, too heavy with children, and history, and need. She had believed it for a long time, the way you believe things that are told to you consistently enough and by enough people. She had carried it through a courthouse and a train, and a Wyoming winter, and a blizzard, and a storm ride that could have killed the man beside her, and she had set it down, piece by piece, in this specific place, and she had never once picked it back up. The world had not rejected her because she was too much. The world had rejected her because it was too small. She had found the one place that was not. Ethan reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest, the way he had done 10,000 times in 20 years, without asking and without ceremony. Just the weight of his hand over hers, steady and warm, and entirely sure. She turned her hand over and held it. The coal ranch stood on its hill in the Wyoming mountains, and the snow came down around it and inside it and beside it. There were people who had been sent away from everywhere else. People who had answered an ad or heard a rumor or followed a road that ended here. People who had arrived with broken wagons and sick children and exhausted horses, and had found improbably and without ceremony a door still open. They had built lives in the rooms that Ethan made, and the school that Sadie built, and the silences that Noah kept, and the meals that came from a kitchen that had never in 20 years turned anyone away from the table. Margaret Cole sat on her porch in the snow and felt the weight of her husband's hand in hers, and she did not need to say what she was thinking, and he did not need to ask. Some people search their whole lives for a place that is built to hold them. Margaret Dawson had ridden 4 days on a train to a stranger's ranch with $31 and 3 children and 1 honest sentence, and she had found hers. And she had never, not for one morning, not for one cold hour, not for one moment, in 20 years of winters and work, and everything the mountain asked of them, ever wished herself anywhere else. This was her life. Every hard, true, enormous inch of it, and it had always been exactly enough.